Welcome back, Rebels, for another video on Star Wars Destiny tips and tricks. So today, we're going to be talking about resources. And I'm not just talking about those little yellow and black tokens that they let you buy upgrades and stuff like that. No. I want to expand your mind today so you can start thinking outside the box when it comes to resource management. And there are, in fact, a lot more resources in Star Wars Destiny than just those little tokens. And I'm going to highlight a few things today that will help you exploit more of the game than you already probably are. So what you need to know going into this is that everything you can interact with some way in Destiny can be considered a sort of resource. And that doesn't just mean money. A resource is anything that you can manage in some way. So we're going to talk about a few different concepts in this video. And if you pay close enough attention, you'll have one leg up on someone who hasn't heard about proper resource management. So let's get started right after these messages. Let's start by talking about the most basic resource unit in the game, the resource token itself. We all know what these do by now, I hope. And if you don't, well, they let you pay for cards out of your hand, and in some cases they resolve dice that require a resource cost. Now that may seem really simple at first, but there are actually a lot of common mistakes people make when managing their resources, and I'm going to highlight a really obvious one that I've seen more times than I can count at this point. So we'll start with this. For those of you who lived through, or rather I should say survived, the Spirit of Rebellion meta, you'll remember seeing this bastard sitting across the table, and he's the start of a deck called the Emo Kids or the Cry Walkers, and what most people seem to forget, or for whatever reason, right, is that this character has what we'd call a pay side, okay? And so does his usual partner, Kylo Ren 1.0, right? And a pay side means that there's a side on the die that costs money, right? Very simple. And as you would expect, it's the same side that actually has the greatest benefit to resolve. It's the highest damage side on his die, sans the special, which actually does damage back to him, right? And that's a Star Wars Destiny thing, by the way. And this isn't the only card that's like this. Now, the mistake I've seen is pretending that this deck, or ones like it, play like every other deck. And what I mean is that you play an upgrade on Vader as your first action, then you roll him out as your second action. And in a lot of cases, the upgrade that you're going to play on him is actually the Vibro Knife, right? Might even be that new, shiny, ancient lightsaber that costs 2 as well. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, players who do this are thinking one of two different ways. And the first thought is, I'm not going to roll max damage, right? And the second is, well, I'll figure out how to pay for that later if I do roll it. And these are both fundamentally flawed ways to approach your dice in Destiny, for the simple fact that these players are taking a risk in having dice sit on the table that may later cost them additional resources. Now, that's not to say that with proper dice fixing by discarding to reroll, a concept we're going to talk about later, that you can't maximize your damage. But then you're basically saying that I'm willing to slow down my entire game to play this Vibro Knife now so I can possibly get +2 damage. And that's just it. You see, you spent 2 resources on potentially +2 damage, and you definitely got an ambush action, which you know has a lot of value too. But if you rolled both 3 melee sides on Vader and resolved them, you'd already do 6 damage. With Vibro Knife, you're taking all your resources away, so you've actually limited the options that you have, which means now you can't pay for cards out of your hand, right? And the best damage that you could hope to resolve with 0 resources is getting 2 melee sides and a +2 melee side in the Vibro Knife, which together also equals 6 damage. So let's talk about math in this scenario because it doesn't get any plainer than this. When you play the Vibro Knife and have no resources left, you've actually made a poor resource management decision when compared to the damage output that you're going for, right? You're going for max damage, which is essentially 6 damage if you've got no resource now. But instead of relying on 2 1 out of 6 chances to get his 3 melee sides on both die, which by the way is a 2.777% chance of actually rolling, you're trying to rely on 3 1 out of 6 chances, which is a 0.463% chance of happening. So you tell me which odds are greater. Let me give you a hint. The odds of rolling a Vader die for max damage with the 2-3 melee is exactly 6 times more likely. So do you still think that playing that vibro knife and zeroing out all of your resources was a good idea? Because remember now, you spent your only 2 resources in this particular scenario. So you're also limiting yourself to only being able to play 0 cost cards in your hand now. And I know that blue villain has a decent amount of these as well, but there's also a lot of blue staples that are 1 cost. Cards like Isolation, now you can't play that. Cards like Deflect, now you can't play that. And what if you've got Feel Your Anger? You can't play it. Lightsaber Throw, Force Strike, Overconfidence, all these cards are now offline because you don't have any resources to play them. Not without Enrage or resolving a resource dice on another character, which, by the way, is a 1 in 6 chance on Kylo if you're playing Kylo, or if you're playing the new Phasma, 1 in 6 chance. The moral of the story here is don't put yourself in a situation where you have turned off your hand because you're all in on upgrades. And don't make a suboptimal play like this, which leads to it, because you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Because I know that if you've got no resources and I'm sitting across the table from you, I now know that I have free reign to do whatever I want for the most part, since you can't pay for removal. And a lot of removal in this game costs at least 1 resource. And this scenario isn't specific to blue villain, for example. There's a lot of characters with pay sides. Baze has a pay side. Han Solo has a pay side. A ton of really good characters have a pay side. So I'm going to let you in on a little secret, okay? And the golden rule in Destiny, and all the good players already know this, is to never cash out completely if you have a die with pay sides that you want to resolve. If your die has a pay side, and it's its strongest side, you want to give yourself the opportunity to potentially resolve it. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to the rule like everything else. Stuff like I'm staring down a disrupt die across the table, or having some card in my hand that's going to really swing the game if I take the chance and zero out my resources. Or maybe I have a card in my hand that's going to let me generate resources later in the game and make up for it. Those sorts of scenarios are going to improve your decisions over time with practice and good deck construction. And I have to admit something to everybody right now. Wow. I really felt the need to say that. And it's because it's been hurting my brain and my heart to see something played like that. I can't call it a misplay per se, but in a way it sort of is. And if no one's ever told you what I just did, well, now you know. And you're already a better player just for hearing it. When you're playing with both pay sides and cards now, you're going to see that it's a heck of a lot easier to manage your game and your rounds when you have both of these things available to you. It's actually kind of magical. The next thing I want to examine as a resource for you all are the cards that you have in your hand. Now, Destiny has a very special way of giving inherent value to the cards in our hand. Each card, besides being playable in some way, also allows you to reroll any amount of your dice by simply discarding it. So if you've got 4 cards, you've got a maximum of 4 rerolls at your disposal. Now you also have to realize the same is true for your opponent as well. Each of their cards is also a reroll. So the ability to use your cards to, say, turn one of their die can give you a great deal of value. And when you're making a deck, you might look at each one of these cards as a potential discard. Something like Use the Force, which turns a die, could be a discard. Even this new card, Sound the Alarm, which allows you to reroll as many of your opponent's die showing damage as you want, could also be considered a sort of discard card. And if this hadn't occurred to you before, then perhaps going forward, hearing this will make you somewhat more aware of it. And if you're a player moving into the competitive scene right now, remember to ask your opponents how many cards they have in your hand if you can't see them clearly. And ask as often as you want, because it's public knowledge and there's a reason for that. It's part of the strategy of messing with their dice to force them into making other decisions that are not favorable for them. And in case this isn't plainly obvious, the reason I'm addressing the cards in your hand in this manner is to illustrate that you can corner your opponent into such decisions that force them to utilize their cards in their hand, which are resources the same for them as they are for you. And I know it seems a bit odd to lead with this, but I wanted to start with the more obscure thing before I move into the more obvious. And it'll all be clear in a few minutes. So let's do that now by looking at some cards. Now, besides looking at turn or reroll cards as a potential resource, there are also some cards that allow you to generate additional cards in your hand. And I've gone over some of these in other videos, but they're worth discussing here because of their impact on the overall game. And I'll talk about them in the order of importance, I suppose. The first one is Boundless Ambition, and it's a card that has seen way too much play since the start of the game. And initially, this card was seen as a way to get you 5 more possible rerolls. And in fact, that's how Vader Raider won Worlds at this past year. But as we saw the meta evolve into arguably bigger and better things, Boundless took on a different spin, and players started to look at it quite differently. It began to look at the cards being drawn by Boundless Ambition for their intended purpose, namely drawing weapons. But of course, those cards can still be discarded for rerolls, right? You can always do that. And the reason Boundless Ambition is good is simply that for a single card, it can draw an estimated maximum value of 5 cards, barring things like Emperor's Favor to augment your hand size. And that's pretty amazing. I mean, if you told me for one resource I can draw 5 cards, why wouldn't I want that, right? I mean, I just got to get rid of all the cards in my hand first other than this one, and that's definitely possible. I mean, I guess against something like a mill deck, you wouldn't necessarily want that. But if the value that you're getting out of those cards is potentially worth it, you'll do it. And so Boundless Ambition abuses the hand as a resource idea at its core. And it's powerful for that reason and the fact that it's so flexible. The next card we're going to talk about is actually new in town, and it's Bounty Postings. It's from Empire at War. And this one's quite a bit different from Boundless Ambition, but is likely to have a minimum value of 2 and a maximum value of 4. It's still not bad, and unlike Boundless, which caps at the hand size, Bounty Posting lets you draw however many cards it says to draw, regardless of your hand size and where you are in the round. So again, we see a lot of potential value in something like this. For one resource, we might draw up to 4 cards, and its value is basically higher earlier in the game than later in the game because chances are you're killing your opponent's characters, and then that's going to have this card draw less cards. It's not a bad card, and I actually predict it might see some edge play going into the current meta. I've already been messing around with it quite a bit. It's a heck of a lot of fun in like a sealed draft and stuff like that, but as far as constructed goes, I guess we'll see sort of where it lands in a few months. And the last card I want to talk about is Award Ceremony. It's another 1-cost event that lets you draw cards. But this time, you'll see it used at the end of the turn when all your characters are exhausted and you still have dice left in a pool that maybe you want to fix with the rerolls. So this one's got a very specific timing to it, which is probably why it doesn't see as much play as something like Boundless Ambition. But it's an option for red nonetheless, and it's another way to gain cards for just 1 resource. So it's definitely not as good as the others because of the way Destiny's played, but hey, it could get you out of a pinch and could certainly increase the damage that you output on a given round. Hit points is one of the most overlooked resources in Star Wars Destiny, and I think the primary reason for that is because there's only one character that blatantly advertises this, and that's the Night Sister. But I don't think that's the only reason people don't really think about hit points as a resource. I think the advent of the hyper aggro decks like Pomaz and Rainbow Nines and the SOR meta basically made a number of cards that might have been good in a slower meta mostly useless because they take time to play. And later we're going to take a look at what I mean by some of those cards that don't see much play for that reason. but that all absolutely illustrate to you that hit points are a resource that you can and that you should manipulate. So let's go back to this lovely lady for a minute. She's a great card, and she's always been a great card. It's never been like some big secret either. And her 7 hit points, which is very low by the way, aren't actually seen as a hindrance in high levels of play. Because those 7 hit points are for fixing your dice with rerolls or controlling an opponent's dice with rerolls. Now maybe it'll make a little more sense why I talked about rerolls earlier, because it was sort of leading up to this. So that 1 hit point can also be a discard for your opponent, potentially. And you know what rerolling one of your dice means? It means not having to discard one of your cards to do it. So you're saving a resource, essentially. You're trading a hit point instead of a card for that reroll. Now, obviously, she's not the same as discarding a card to reroll, because she can only reroll 1 dice rather than several die. But that can be super handy all on its own. And I personally love to use Night Sister as a control character in like expanded point formats, because I don't play a lot of villain. I think she's like my first thought when I think about what to do with A points in a villain deck. If she fits, she's in a lot of different cases. All right, enough about Night Sister. Let's talk about one more card that sees a ton of play and is an awesome example of hit points as a resource. And if you've been watching this video and you've been thinking red, you guessed it, because it's the best defense. And it literally is, because this card is considered the best removal card in the game, and for good reason. You take 3 damage, and that can be into shields, by the way, and remove 2 dice of your choice. Holy crap. Negotiate doesn't do that, and hero players everywhere are very sad because of that. So if there is a red non-unique character in your deck, heck, even a unique character in a lot of cases, this is generally considered card number 1 and 2 when you're constructing your deck nearly every single time. To put it in perspective, it can completely lock out an entire elite character for the round. Are you still wondering why this card is good? Because if you are, you need to rewind this video like 30 seconds and listen to this part again. Alright, so to continue our discussion on hit points as a resource, we're going to come over here to our explanation screen and talk about a few of those cards I mentioned earlier that also illustrate that hit points should be seen as a resource by players who played Destiny. So the first one up here is Draw Attention, and this is one of the earliest cards that was printed that wanted you to look at hit points as sort of a resource. And it allows you to move up to 2 damage from one of your characters to another one of your characters, essentially offloading your damage on your big hero to maybe a less important character or something like that. And that can be pretty significant. Now, in a really quick meta, you're going to see how a lot of these cards tend to have a lower impact, because even for 0 to move damage around, you're taking a lot more than 2 damage, and you can't really keep up with things, unfortunately. The second card is quite a bit similar, and it's Willpower, and it's blue, and it costs 1 this time, and it actually allows you to move a damage from one of your exhausted characters to an opponent's exhausted character. So this is a bit like Draw Attention, right? But instead of moving stuff between your own characters, it actually lets you take a character that damage you've been dealt, stick it on someone else across the table, which is pretty cool. In fact, you can use this to even kill a character, which is quite neat. And the third one here is Impersonate, and this one's new as well. It's from Empire at War, and I really like this card a lot. It is a little expensive at 2, but it's, I think, better in a lot of ways than both of these cards, because it allows you to move damage among your characters as you wish. So if you're playing something like 3 or 4 characters, and you're talking about taking 10 or 12 damage and spreading it around, that can actually be really great, because you can just pile it all on to another character if you really, really want. Heck, you can kill a character with Impersonate. You just can't exceed their health, but you can absolutely put the exact amount of damage on them if you want to get rid of them. So this can be a really swingy kind of card, and it's another one of those cards, again, that's trying to show you that, listen, you should use hit points as a resource. The damage being dealt can be shuffled around, and you should take advantage of that if you've got the additional resources to do that. In fact, you can probably think about a really annoying yellow and blue deck with this kind of stuff in it and really drive your opponent nuts. So let's talk about some characters that actually look at hit points as a resource as opposed to events and stuff like that. So the first one we're going to look at is a new card from Empire at War, which is Bosk. And Bosk allows you to move one damage from an opponent's character to another character when you activate him. So if your opponent's trying to use, hit point moving shenanigans like with the previous cards, which is unlikely because they don't see a ton of play, Bosk can actually adjust things. And there's other cards too that you can play with Bosk to do very similar things that I didn't mention in the previous slide. But he's another example of a character who likes to do this. And the second character we're going to talk about is pretty brutal when it comes to looking at hit points as a resource. He's kind of an extreme example, and he's also from Empire at War, and that's the Magna Guard. And the Magna Guard has a text on it that says, before this character would be defeated by damage, instead, defeat it after this round ends. So the Magna Guard can actually take a ton of damage even after he dies. So let's say, for example, that your opponent kills this character. He doesn't die until the end of the round. So his dies stay in the pool. You can resolve them in whatever way you can possibly do that, because he's got some pay side. So, you got to manage your resources, right, to be able to do that. But let's say you're also holding on to a best defense. You can best defense Magna Guard, and you can overkill him. And it doesn't matter because he's taking damage. He just gets defeated again or whatever. It doesn't make a difference because he's not going to die until the end of the round. So this is a character that really takes it to the extreme when it comes to managing hit points as a resource. Now imagine giving this guy Guardian and he's at 7 hit points and eating a 3 die or something like that. He still gets to use his die for that round. There's a lot of great potential here. In fact, in our sealed draft on Saturday down at Highlander, I actually saw the Magna Guard face off against a Cad Bane, and the Cad Bane killed a Magna Guard, but Magna Guard had lethal damage showing on Cad Bane, and they had run out of time for the round, so they had to finish. And Magna Guard was able to kill Cad Bane off despite actually dying first. So this guy has a ton of potential for a character. And he's just another great example of really looking at those hit points as a massive resource when you consider some of the cards we've looked at and what you could potentially pull off with him. All right, so that about wraps it up for this video, which was about, again, examining all your resources. And today we looked at not only token resources and giving you a tip or two on how to properly manage those to maximize your dice, but we also looked at cards in hand as a resource. And we discussed things like turning, things like re-rolling, things like forcing your opponent into decisions that they don't want to make or aren't favorable for them. We talked about cards that allow you to draw additional cards. And if you've seen the video on things that included card advantage, and you link that up with some of the concepts here, you're going to have a better understanding of why those cards in hand as a resource is such a big deal. Then we moved on to talking about hit points as a resource, and we looked at a card like Night Sister. We looked at a card like Best Defense. We looked at some cards that allow you to move hit points around, to damage around rather. And then we also looked at some characters that do something very similar. And all these things are part of the Destiny developers trying to get you to see that there are more resources in Destiny than just those 2 resources you start every round with. There's a plethora of them. And there are some other smaller examples too. There's really a lot to go over in this particular topic, and of course, specific strategies for how you would manage a particular scenario are difficult to answer in a video that's trying to hit upon some of the more general topics here. But I hope that in watching this video, it's expanded your view of what the cards in Destiny are trying to communicate, and also expanded your ability to interact with the game better and see the game differently, so that perhaps when you're looking at these new cards in Empire at War or in a future set, you can look at that card and say, wow, this card really looks at this as a resource, and that's something new, or that's a different spin on it, or maybe this works in another deck type that I was really trying to use, and now this card is like the missing link for it. So really, again, this is about expanding your mind and your view on things. So I hope that in watching this, that's the effect that it's had on you. So if there's anything that I perhaps have missed, as far as resources go or any corrections, please put those down in the comments, and I'm always more than happy to respond to those because, hey, I make mistakes, right? And sometimes I even miss a really important part of these particular topics that I really feel like should have gone in there. But this is what I came up with over the past 48 hours. So I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you learned something. And if you liked all that stuff, then check out my Facebook page, which is down in the link below the video, and subscribe to me here on YouTube. And tell your buddies to come over and check it out too. If they're getting into Destiny, that's what a lot of these videos that I put on the channel so far have really been aimed at, these new players. And I guess I'll see you next time, right? Probably Tuesday, maybe Wednesday, depending on when I get some time to do a video together. And until then, may the force be with all of you.